The desert sun had already dipped low on the horizon when Sophia and Oliver Martin pulled their SUV into the sandy lot near the Hidden Valley trailhead, its fading warmth spilling gold across the vast, jagged boulders of Joshua Tree National Park. To outsiders, they must have looked like any other young couple seeking a weekend escape, the husband unloading gear with practiced efficiency, while his heavily pregnant wife stretched her back and breathed slowly against the weight of 7 months of carrying life. Their cooler rattled with the sound of ice shifting as Oliver lifted it, a tent bag slung over his shoulder, while Sophia carefully laid out a blanket to rest on, her hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. They had told Christine Ellis, Sophia's mother, that they wanted one last adventure together before the baby arrived, a memory carved into desert silence before sleepless nights and bottles overtook them. The wind was calm that Friday evening, stirring faint whispers in the twisted branches of the Joshua trees, their arms reaching skyward like ancient sentinels watching the Martins' every move. By the time stars scattered across the wide black sky, their campfire flickered small and humble against the immensity of the desert, and Sophia, despite her exhaustion, had smiled at Oliver, remarking that the flames reminded her of the candles they used to light when electricity would go out during storms back home. In that moment, they looked almost unshakable, 2 lives tethered by hope and the promise of a future. Yet within days, all that remained of them was the SUV abandoned near the trailhead, doors locked, keys gone, and the desert quiet once more. Search teams found nothing but boot prints, vanishing into soft sand and a cooler half filled with water bottles, now warm from the Sunday. The heat rose above the rocks like a hallucination, distorting vision and patience. And volunteers who scoured the terrain found themselves circling back to the same formations, lost in an endless mirage of stone and silence. When helicopters traced the ridges and dogs followed faint trails that dissolved beneath shifting dunes, nothing surfaced. The Martins seemed to have been swallowed whole by the land itself, leaving their families with grief that burned hotter than the desert Sunday. For Christine, it felt like the earth had tilted off its axis that summer of 2012, her world caving in as if Joshua Tree had not just stolen her daughter and unborn grandchild, but time itself. A trailhead that should have been a marker of return became instead the gateway to a hollow absence, where questions outnumbered answers and sorrow bled into every memory of Sophia's laughter. The morning after the Martins' abandoned car was discovered at the Hidden Valley trailhead, the desert echoed not with silence but with the mechanical thrum of helicopters circling low, their blades slicing the hot air as search crews scanned the sprawling wilderness for any trace of the missing couple. From above, the vastness of Joshua Tree looked both beautiful and merciless, its endless fields of rock and sand swallowing footprints as easily as waves erase marks in the tide. And those who stared down from the helicopters saw only shifting shapes of boulders and the pale lines of forgotten paths. On the ground, search dogs strained against their leashes, noses low to the sand, pulling their handlers across jagged terrain as the animals caught faint whiffs of human scent that seemed to vanish into thin air, teasing and tormenting with promise but never resolution. Volunteers in neon vests fanned out across the valleys, their water bottles rattling and their boots crunching against gravel as they called Sophia's and Oliver's names into the desert, their voices carried off by the dry wind until they dissolved into nothing. The heat was relentless, turning each day into a furnace, and even the most determined began to feel the weight of futility pressing down as days stretched into weeks. Each sunrise brought fresh determination, but each sunset carried only disappointment, their flashlights sweeping the desert floor for signs that were never there. Reporters arrived with cameras, recording Christine Ellis as she stood near the command post, clutching a photo of her pregnant daughter and pleading for answers, her voice breaking beneath the strain of hope and despair. Detectives gave statements to the press, their words careful and rehearsed, admitting no evidence of foul play, yet unable to explain how two healthy adults could vanish so completely. Theories sprouted like weeds, some insisting the desert had claimed them through exhaustion and dehydration, others whispering darker possibilities of violence or hidden crimes concealed by the wilderness. The weeks wore on and supplies dwindled, search parties returning with cracked lips, blistered feet, and nothing to show but the deepening lines of frustration etched into their faces. Maps, with red markers spread across tables in the ranger station, looked more like chaotic webs than strategies, a record of desperation that offered no clarity. By the end of the third week, many volunteers had gone home, their energy drained and their faith dimmed, leaving only a skeleton crew of officials determined to keep looking. The desert remained unmoved, ancient and indifferent, its rocks and shadows keeping secrets no one could pry free. While Christine stood vigil at the trailhead, praying against the growing certainty that Joshua Tree had claimed Sophia, Oliver, and their unborn child for itself. Christine Ellis lived the years after her daughter's disappearance as though time had frozen in the summer of 2012, moving through her house like a ghost among relics, careful not to disturb the space that still bore Sophia's presence. The bedroom remained untouched, its lavender curtains faded but intact, the framed photos of Sophia and Oliver on the dresser standing as though the couple had only just left for their weekend in Joshua Tree. A pair of maternity dresses hung neatly in the closet, their fabric gathering dust, but Christine refused to pack them away, convinced that removing them would be the same as admitting defeat. Each morning she brewed tea and sat in the living room with the phone beside her, waiting for a call that never came, yet still dialing the sheriff's office weekly to ask about the investigation. Detectives grew accustomed to her voice, answering politely, though their updates offered little more than recycled phrases, the words "no new leads," striking her heart like a dull hammer again and again. To the public, she became the face of perseverance, speaking at community events, holding candlelight vigils, and urging volunteers not to forget the missing couple, her voice quivering with grief, yet anchored by unshakable conviction. Reporters sometimes turned their cameras away when the case grew stale, but Christine held fast, clutching Sophia's photograph and reminding anyone who would listen that a pregnant daughter does not simply vanish into the desert night. She learned to weave her pain into speeches that reached beyond her town, drawing support from strangers who mailed her letters of encouragement, their words pressed against her refrigerator like talismans. At night, she lit a candle in the window, a silent beacon she hoped might somehow guide Sophia home, and when neighbors asked if it wasn't painful to cling so tightly, she would answer with the steadiness of a mother unwilling to let go, insisting that faith, however fragile, was the only thing that kept her standing. Christine's days became measured by anniversaries, each September marking another year without her daughter, each year sharpening the ache rather than dulling it, like a wound that refused to scar over. In the stillness of her home, surrounded by photographs and silence, Christine's vigil was not just for Sophia and Oliver, but for the unborn grandchild she had never met, a tiny heartbeat that had disappeared along with them, leaving Christine with the unbearable duty of remembering for three. By the autumn of 2023, the desert had long reclaimed its silence, swallowing the memories of those who had disappeared within its vast, unforgiving reaches. And James Brown, a seasoned hiker who had spent years tracing the less-traveled paths of Joshua Tree, found himself wandering into one of its loneliest corners. He had set out early that morning with little more than a backpack, water, and his own stubborn desire to avoid the crowds of tourists who clustered near the marked trails, preferring instead to let his boots cut across stretches of untouched sand where the sun burned brighter and the air felt ancient. Hours into his trek, sweat stung his brow and exhaustion slowed his steps, his canteen already half empty, and he wondered if perhaps he had pushed too far into land that did not forgive human arrogance. He almost passed it by. A glint of metal in the sand, muted by rust, yet sharp enough to catch the corner of his eye as the wind shifted. At first he thought it might be debris left by careless campers, but when he bent down, brushing grit away with calloused fingers, he realized it was no simple fragment. A length of corroded tent pole jutted from the ground, its once sturdy frame bent and brittle, the desert's patience having gnawed it into ruin. Something in him tightened as he crouched lower, pulling back more sand until a shape emerged beneath, canvas fabric stiffened with years of heat and dust. The collapsed shell of a tent revealed itself slowly, like a wound reopening after years of being hidden, and James felt a weight settle over him, the uncanny sense of trespassing into a story that did not belong to him. His throat tightened when he saw fabric caught within the folds, faded but unmistakable, a sweater with a pattern almost erased by time, its pale threads clinging stubbornly to the memory of color. He did not need to be told it was no ordinary find. The silence around him deepened, as though the desert itself held its breath, and James's pulse quickened with the certainty that he had stumbled into something grave, something that would call the past roaring back into the present. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching long across the barren earth, and looked out at the endless horizon where Joshua trees rose like watchmen, their twisted arms framing his discovery, as though they had been guarding it for 11 long years, waiting for someone willing to see. James knelt with trembling hands, pulling back the stiff canvas of the tent, as though peeling away the layers of a secret that the desert had guarded for over a decade, his breath catching when the dim sunlight revealed bones half buried in sand, bleached pale by the relentless sun, fragile as chalk yet arranged in a way that told a story of collapse rather than rest. The sight rooted him in place, for in all his years wandering the wilderness he had encountered rattlesnake skins, weathered deer skulls, and the hollow shells of forgotten campsites, but never the human echo of a life cut short, never the stark reminder that this desert was not merely beautiful, but merciless in its ability to consume. Draped across the skeletal frame lay the tattered threads of what had once been a maternity sweater. The fabric stretched and torn, the faint outline of pastel embroidery clinging stubbornly against years of wind and grit, and in that instant, James did not need anyone to tell him whose remains he had found. A wave of sorrow pressed against his chest as he reached deeper, his fingers brushing against something harder than fabric, and he pulled free a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked and stiff, yet bearing a name, etched faintly but still legible. Sophia Martin. The letters struck him like thunder, the weight of memory rising from news articles he had skimmed years earlier, stories of a young pregnant woman and her husband who had vanished without a trace in 2012, their mystery haunting families and authorities, but fading from headlines as other tragedies took their place. He sat back on his heels, the journal heavy in his hands, sand sifting through the pages as though reluctant to let go, and he wondered at the courage of a woman who had written here, in the last place she had known, words meant for no one but herself, never knowing if anyone would read them. Around him the desert seemed to stretch wider, its silence deepening, the Joshua trees like statues keeping watch, and James felt both intruder and messenger, chosen unwillingly by circumstance to stumble upon the Martins' grave. His stomach knotted, torn between the instinct to flee and the responsibility to honor what he had found, for this was not just a discovery but a haunting. A reminder that the desert gives nothing freely, only returns what it chooses when it is ready. By the time the sun began to sink behind the serrated ridges of Joshua Tree, the lonely discovery that James Brown had stumbled upon was no longer his burden alone, for the quiet of the desert was shattered by the crackle of radios and the crunch of boots, as park rangers marked off the site with fluorescent tape, their faces drawn with the solemnity that comes only when the earth yields back a secret it has kept too long. Word spread quickly, and within hours the campsite that had lain buried for 11 years was illuminated by floodlights brought in on trucks, casting eerie shadows across the twisted branches of the Joshua trees that loomed like ancient sentinels bearing witness. Technicians crouched carefully over the remains, brushing away sand with gloved hands, their voices hushed, though the evidence already spoke with the finality of death. The maternity sweater, fragile and torn, was sealed tenderly in plastic, and the leather-bound journal marked with Sophia's name was catalogued, in its pages to be examined later by specialists who understood that words written at the edge of life might hold more weight than any official report. DNA analysis was expedited, the process quickened by urgency and memory, and when the results returned with confirmation that the bones belonged to Sophia Martin, the story that had lingered in silence since 2012 roared back into public consciousness, dragging sorrow and speculation with it. Detective Carla Reyes, who had been a junior investigator when the Martins first went missing, stepped forward now as the lead. Her resolve hardened by years of unanswered questions, and she declared before the cameras that this was no longer a search for two missing campers, but the reopening of a case that demanded truth, no matter how painful. To Christine Ellis, the news struck with a double edge. For the confirmation of her daughter's death carried the cruel finality she had resisted for over a decade, yet also the fragile hope that answers might at last be within reach. Journalists gathered like vultures at the ranger station, reporters thrusting microphones toward officials, headlines already framing the discovery as both tragic and sensational, while online forums ignited with renewed theories about what had happened to Sophia, Oliver, and their unborn child in the desolate expanse of Joshua Tree. For James, who watched from the sidelines, it felt as if the weight of his discovery had only grown heavier, the haunting truth that the desert had chosen him as its messenger, now binding him to a mystery that refused to rest. The journal, weathered and stiff from years of desert heat, was laid open on a sterile table inside the evidence room, its fragile pages turned with gloved hands, as though the very air might cause them to crumble, and as investigators read, Sophia Martin's voice seemed to rise again from the silence of the grave, her words carrying the intimacy of a diary never meant for other eyes. In the beginning, the entries were tender, almost idyllic, her handwriting looping easily as she described the baby's kicks against her ribs, her excitement at one last trip with Oliver before motherhood began, and her awe at the vast night sky over Joshua Tree, which she likened to a cathedral of stars. She wrote of Oliver's carefulness, how he built their fire, how he rubbed her swollen ankles after long walks, and how she believed this trip would be a memory to carry them through the hard nights of sleepless parenting ahead. Yet as the pages advanced, the tone shifted, the ink pressing deeper into the paper as though her hand had grown heavier, and a tension emerged in her words that suggested the harmony had fractured. She wrote of arguments with Oliver, disagreements that seemed trivial on the surface about food, about routes, about whether she should be hiking so far into the desert at 7 months pregnant. But beneath the lines was an undercurrent of fear, as if her irritation masked something deeper, something unsettled. Then came the entries that made Detective Carla Reyes pause. For Sophia described the sensation of being watched, of waking in the night, certain that footsteps had circled their camp, of seeing shadows move just beyond the firelight before vanishing into the desert blackness. She noted Oliver's dismissals, his insistence that exhaustion and nerves were playing tricks on her, but her words betrayed her certainty that they were not alone. The later pages grew more frantic, her sentences shorter, her hand shaking enough that letters blurred into one another. and she began marking times in the margins, strange notations with arrows pointing to compass directions, as if she were attempting to track something or someone moving around them. In the final entry, her writing broke into jagged lines, the words scrawled with haste, confessing that she feared for the baby, that Oliver was restless, and that something in the desert air felt predatory, alive, and closing in. The investigators exchanged grim looks, for in those fragile pages, Sophia had left not only a record of her last days, but a chilling echo of dread that still seemed to cling to the paper itself. When news of the discovery broke, it spread like wildfire through the small desert towns, and then beyond, carried by television anchors and online forums until the story of Sophia and Oliver Martin once again became the nation's obsession, reigniting debates that had lain dormant since 2012. Headlines flashed across screens with dramatic urgency, some calling it a tragic accident finally explained, others framing it as a sinister mystery only deepened by the revelations in Sophia's journal. Theories sprouted like weeds after a storm, tangled and relentless, fed by speculation rather than evidence. Some insisted the desert itself had claimed them, that dehydration and heat stroke had driven the young couple to panic, leading them off the trails into oblivion. Others whispered darker possibilities, resurrecting old rumors of cartel activity near the border, stories of drug mules and hidden routes through the wilderness where unlucky hikers who stumbled across the wrong people vanished without a trace. A new wave of armchair detectives seized upon the idea of a murder-suicide, pointing to the arguments recorded in the journal, casting Oliver as a man who might have snapped under the pressure of impending fatherhood and the isolation of the desert night. Others defended him fiercely, describing him as another victim, his bones still unaccounted for, but his innocence visible in the tenderness described in the early pages of Sophia's writing. Social media turned brutal in its polarizing certainty, with hashtags dragging Oliver's name through accusation, while others sanctified him as a devoted husband caught in a nightmare beyond his control. Podcasts dedicated episodes to dissecting the handwriting, to analyzing the coded compass markings, to debating whether predators could have been involved, coyotes or even mountain lions stalking the camp while the couple slept. Christine Ellis, now grey-haired and weary from 11 years of grieving, found herself thrust again into the glare of microphones, reporters crowding her front steps to demand her opinion, her voice cracking as she pleaded for compassion, reminding the world that these were not characters in a story but her daughter, her son-in-law, and the unborn grandchild who would never draw breath. For Detective Carla Reyes, the speculation was both a curse and a weapon, for though the noise obscured the truth, it also renewed public pressure to find answers, and she knew the longer Sophia's words lingered without resolution, the more they would be twisted into stories that served everyone's hunger but Christine's need for peace. Christine Ellis sat at her kitchen table with the box in front of her, her hands trembling as though the cardboard itself carried a pulse, the air thick with the weight of what she had been waiting 11 years to receive, yet never truly wanted to face. Inside lay Sophia's belongings, catalogued and bagged with the neat precision of evidence. But to Christine they were fragments of a life she had once held in her arms, reminders of laughter, of small, ordinary moments, of a daughter whose absence had hollowed her world. She lifted the maternity sweater first, its fabric faded and brittle, pressing it to her face in a desperate attempt to find even a trace of the scent that had once clung to Sophia. But there was nothing, only the sterile smell of plastic and dust, and still Christine held it as though it might dissolve if she let go. Then she opened the journal, her heart pounding so violently that she thought it might shatter her ribs, and as she began to read the entries, Sophia's voice seemed to echo across the years, tender at first, filled with the quiet joy of a mother dreaming of her child, describing the kicks, the stars above the desert, and Oliver's gentle care. Christine smiled through her tears, imagining her daughter's face glowing in the firelight. Yet as the pages darkened, so too did Christine's spirit, her chest tightening as the words turned frantic, fearful, heavy with dread that crept closer with each line. She read the arguments, the unease, the notations of footsteps and shadows, and with each word she felt as though the walls of her house leaned inward, pressing her beneath the same invisible weight that had once pressed upon Sophia in that desert night. But then came the final plea, scrawled hastily, almost incoherent. Sophia begging that her unborn child be protected, that even if she did not survive, someone might save the life growing within her. Christine broke then, the tears spilling unchecked, her sobs raw and unrestrained, shaking her as violently as an earthquake tearing through stone. But even through the devastation, she clung to that line like a prayer. She whispered to the empty room that she would carry that plea, that she would honor the grandchild she never met, that she would keep Sophia alive not only in memory but in the vow of protection that no mother, not even death, could take from her. Detective Carla Reyes sat hunched over the dimly lit evidence table. Sophia Martin's journal spread open before her like a confession written to time itself, the fragile pages weighed down by small plastic markers so they would not curl beneath the air from the overhead fan. She had read through the entries several times already, but it was not the words alone that caught her attention now. It was the symbols scratched hastily into the margins, tiny notations that at first glance looked like smudges of ink, but upon closer inspection revealed themselves to be deliberate. Next to certain passages were initials, letters that repeated without explanation, sometimes alone, sometimes beside what appeared to be times written in 24-hour format, and in other places, arrows accompanied by crude compass points that pointed north, east, or southwest. Carla frowned, her pen tapping the table, for it seemed less the rambling of a frightened woman than the method of someone keeping track, documenting something she feared too much to spell out in full. She leaned closer, reading one particular entry where Sophia had written of hearing footsteps outside the tent just past midnight, and in the margin beside it she had scrawled the initials LB, with an arrow pointing northeast. Another page carried the same set of initials but at a different time, and always paired with a direction, as though Sophia had been tracking movement around their camp, piecing together the pattern of a presence that circled them in the night. Carla's stomach tightened, for she remembered that the park had once employed a staff member whose initials matched, a ranger who had vanished under strange circumstances a few months after the Martins. She pulled up the old personnel files, her fingers shaking slightly as she realized Sophia's words may not have been paranoia but a desperate attempt to leave behind a map, a record that could speak when she no longer could. The compass marks formed a web of angles that suggested encirclement, someone shadowing the couple across several nights, and the times matched the hours when Sophia had described her growing unease. The shadows, she swore, were not illusions. Reyes closed the journal slowly, her mind turning with possibilities. The detective's instinct whispering that Sophia had given them more than grief-stained pages. She had left breadcrumbs, a code of fear written in haste that pointed not to accident or imagination but to pursuit. The floodlights hummed softly against the desert night as investigators widened their search around the collapsed tent, shovels biting into the hard-packed earth where wind had swept dunes into shallow mounds, the ground reluctant to yield its secrets after 11 long years. The rangers moved with methodical precision, brushing away layers of sand, their gloves blackened by grit, until one of them called out sharply, the sound carrying through the quiet air like a crack of thunder. Kneeling down, Detective Carla Reyes saw the glint first. A faint shimmer beneath the soil that seemed out of place in a world of stone and dust, and as the earth gave way, the small circle of a wedding band emerged, its gold dulled but still intact, engraved inside with the simple words O to S, forever. Her breath caught as the weight of recognition settled in, for it was Oliver Martin's ring, proof that his story had not wandered far from Sophia's, their fates buried together under the same merciless sky. Yet the discovery was not complete, for beneath the ring fragments of bone protruded, fragile, incomplete, as if the desert had devoured more than it returned, offering only pieces of a man rather than the whole. The forensic team whispered among themselves, noting how the shallow grave seemed hastily dug, uneven and shallow, not the kind of resting place chosen with care, but one carved quickly, perhaps under duress, perhaps in fear. Carla's mind churned with questions that pressed harder than the heat ever had. If Oliver had been buried here, why had Sophia's remains been left in the tent, exposed and half swallowed by sand? And what had happened in the gap between? The theories that had haunted the case for years unraveled and tangled again, some pointing toward violence within the marriage, others toward an outside hand that had sought to hide one body while abandoning the other. The ring, with its inscription, felt like a voice from the grave, a reminder of promises cut short, and Carla held it in her gloved palm as though it carried the final echo of Oliver's presence. Around her, the desert remained indifferent, the night air cool and sharp, coyotes yipping faintly in the distance as if mocking the human intrusion into land that belonged to no one. The partial remains were carefully lifted, tagged, and sealed, yet even as they were carried away under sterile light, the discovery deepened rather than answered the mystery, the grave whispering that the desert still held more truths than it had surrendered. James Brown found himself unable to shake the images from his mind. The desert, no longer a place of quiet refuge, but a living memory that invaded his sleep and poisoned the silence of his days. For every time he closed his eyes, he saw the collapsed tent again, the bones half buried in sand, and the faded sweater that spoke more loudly than any words ever could. At night, he dreamed of Sophia and Oliver, not as photographs from old articles, but as restless figures circling their campfire, their faces hollowed by fear, their voices calling out into the dark, where shadows moved just beyond reach. And he woke, drenched in sweat, the sound of wind through Joshua trees echoing in his ears like whispers meant only for him. He had always believed the desert to be impartial, a place that stripped a man down to his endurance and will. But now he wondered if it had chosen him deliberately, guiding his steps off the marked trail until his boot struck metal and history forced itself into the present. He replayed the hours of that day with obsessive clarity, the way the sun had burned on his neck, the dryness in his throat, the decision to veer left rather than right, and he asked himself if fate had drawn him there, if some unseen hand had orchestrated the moment so the Martins would not remain lost forever. In the daylight, strangers hailed him as a hero, reporters shoving microphones in his face to capture sound bites of discovery. Yet he felt no triumph in their words, only the heaviness of being tethered to grief that was not his, a messenger cursed to carry sorrow he had not lived but could never escape. He stopped hiking, his boots gathering dust in the corner of his small house, for even the thought of stepping into wilderness filled him with unease, as though the desert might demand another secret from him, something he was not prepared to give. Friends told him to let go, to remember that he had given a family closure, but James felt no closure within himself, only a gnawing unease that the desert had not finished speaking, that its silence still pressed against him with a weight that no time could erase. Alone at night, staring into darkness, he whispered questions no one could answer, wondering if he had been chosen or cursed to uncover what should have remained buried. Detective Carla Reyes sat in her office long after the others had left. The hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound, as she traced Sophia Martin's notations again and again, her eyes settling on the repeated initials that haunted the margins of the journal like fingerprints left in the dark. LB. Always paired with times of night and compass marks, details so consistent they could not be random, and as she combed through the park's old employment records, she felt a chill prickle the back of her neck when a name surfaced that matched those letters. A seasonal ranger named Leonard Brooks, who had vanished quietly in late 2012, only months after the Martins disappeared. At the time, his absence had been dismissed as a resignation, a drifter's life moving on without goodbye. But Carla dug deeper, finding reports of other hikers who had gone missing in those same years. Their cases cold and scattered, each buried in the endless files of Joshua Tree's history. Written off as accidents, heat, dehydration, the usual explanations given to grieving families who never questioned further. Yet when the cases were mapped, when the dates were plotted against one another, a troubling pattern emerged. Disappearances clustering around the same trails, the same remote stretches of land, forming a circle of vanishing that could not be ignored. Carla leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening, for Sophia had not simply been frightened, she had been recording something. Someone, a presence tied not only to her own fate, but to others swallowed by the desert before and after her. Leonard Brooks's personnel file described him as dependable, familiar with the terrain, but whispers from surviving staff members painted him differently, a man who preferred to work the night shifts, who knew unmarked paths, who grew withdrawn in those final months before he vanished himself. Reyes stared at his photograph, the blurred edges of an old ID badge, and felt the strange collision of dread and clarity, as though the desert itself had handed her the thread Sophia had tried to leave behind. If Brooks had been involved, then his disappearance was not freedom but consequence, a link in a chain of violence that had left families fractured for over a decade. The detective closed the journal gently, her resolve hardening. For Joshua Tree was no longer just the backdrop of a tragedy, but a graveyard of secrets, and the name emerging from Sophia's desperate scrawl might be the key to opening them all. Detective Carla Reyes sifted through stacks of reports and maps spread across the conference table, the glow of overhead lights casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the weight of what she was uncovering, her pen circling dates and locations until the paper looked more like a battlefield than a case file. Each mark represented a disappearance, each circle a life swallowed by the desert. And the more she compared Sophia Martin's coded entries with Joshua Tree's history, the clearer the possibility became that the Martins had not simply been victims of misfortune but witnesses to something far darker. Witnesses spoke of strange sightings near the backcountry trails in the years around 2012. Headlights moving at hours when the park should have been empty, convoys of vehicles stopping briefly near washes and then vanishing into the night. Old ranger logs mentioned unexplained tire tracks, reports that were quickly closed without follow-up, while border enforcement records hinted at the desert being used as a corridor for illicit movement, trafficking of drugs or even people, its vastness offering perfect cover for those who knew how to navigate it. Reyes leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at one line, in an old report describing campers who had stumbled across armed men late at night and were chased off, never to return. It was easy to see how Sophia and Oliver, setting their tent too close to routes guarded by desperation and violence, might have been silenced before they could ever leave. Leonard Brooks's name surfaced again, his night patrols placing him near the same areas at the same times, raising the question of whether he had been complicit or merely a witness who vanished before investigators could ever question him. Theories sprouted even among the detectives. Some convinced the Martins had seen something they were never meant to see, others whispering of cover-ups that reached deeper than one rogue ranger, perhaps into networks that thrived on silence and fear. Yet for every lead, the desert still swallowed evidence, its shifting sands erasing tracks, its silence refusing to yield the final proof, leaving only fragments of possibility. Carla knew she stood on the edge of truth, close enough to glimpse its shape yet too far to hold it fully, the desert taunting her with half-answers and echoes. The suspects were shadows, the motives obscured, and though the outlines of a crime grew clearer, the full truth remained buried in that vast and indifferent wilderness, waiting for someone willing to dig deeper still. The sun dipped low across the jagged silhouette of Joshua Tree as mourners gathered in a circle of folding chairs, their faces softened by the golden light, the desert stretching endlessly behind them like an ocean of silence. And at the center of it all stood a simple headstone engraved with 3 names: Sophia Martin, Oliver Martin, and beneath them, Baby Martin. Never born, but never forgotten. Christine Ellis stood before the stone with trembling hands, clutching a sheet of paper she could barely read through her tears, her voice cracking as she spoke to the friends, family, and strangers who had come to honor the lives lost. She spoke of Sophia's childhood laughter, of Oliver's kindness, of the anticipation that had filled their family when they learned of the baby on the way, a joy that had been cruelly extinguished in the heat of the desert. She admitted her years of waiting, her candles burning each night, her belief that somehow the desert might give back what it had taken, and though the truth was heavier than she had ever prepared herself to bear, she vowed that their memory would not vanish again into silence. The words faltered at times, yet they carried the strength of a mother whose love had outlasted time, and when she placed her hand against the stone, it was as though she pressed her palm to Sophia's cheek once more. Among the crowd stood James Brown, his posture quiet, his face pale. A man both witness and mourner, for though he had never known the Martins in life, he had walked uninvited into their death, and he carried that weight like a second shadow. His eyes stayed fixed on the stone, his chest tight with the knowledge that it was his boot that had struck the metal pole, his hands that had brushed the sand away, his decision to look closer that had dragged the past into the present. Detective Carla Reyes lingered nearby, her arms crossed, her mind still restless with unanswered questions. Yet even she bowed her head in reverence, understanding that sometimes closure meant not the solving of every mystery, but the acknowledgement of lives lived and lost. As the ceremony ended, the desert wind stirred gently through the branches of the Joshua trees, their twisted arms swaying like guardians, and Christine whispered one final promise to her daughter, her son-in-law, and the grandchild she never held, that their story would be remembered, and their love carried forward as long as she drew breath.